There was a dog who stayed at his owner's grave all day and night, which caught the attention of a priest who was visiting. The priest checked underneath the dog and found something unusual, so he called the police. People were puzzled by the dog's unwavering dedication to his owner's grave until they discovered the reason behind it. Normally, when someone passes away, their pets are taken care of by family members or given to a shelter to find a new home. But this dog had a different plan. The man in this story lost his life while trying to stop some criminals, and everyone was amazed to see that his loyal dog refused to leave his side at the graveside. However, something unexpected happened that changed everything. At the time of this incident, Officer Ben had only been a police officer for a few years, but he had always dreamed of working with police dogs. When Ben finally met his four-legged partner, he couldn't contain his joy. The police officer and Lord hit it off right away and were quickly trained to respond to each other in all kinds of situations. Ben, Lord spent lots of time together, and the four-legged canine even came to live with his handler. That way they could always be in tune with one another. Should an emergency happen, and they were called in, but as time went by, Ben came to love Lord as if he was a member of his own family. The two had ended up doing everything together, from sleeping on the sofa to taking long walks in the park. When the dog was off duty, he loved to play with everyone the two came across on their walks. One day, Ben and Lord were sitting in a patrol car when all of a sudden, a call came through over the radio about a robbery that was happening close by. Ben immediately started this car's sirens up and began to make his way to the scene. The police officer had been told over the radio that he would be pursuing two suspects who had attempted to rob a nearby house but had been spotted by the owner. Ben arrived at the scene only to see the two suspects running away on foot. The man drove after the criminals, determined to catch up with them and arrest them, but just as he was about to get close enough to stop them, the two men ran into some nearby woods. Ben stopped the car and looked into the woods. Due to how close Ben had been to the scene of the crime, he had been the first to arrive at the location. This meant that he didn't have any backup apart from Lord, who had been barking from the back of the car. The entire time that they had been in pursuit of the criminals, Ben knew that he shouldn't go after the two men, as he didn't know what they could be armed with, and he had no one to back him up should he find himself in a bad situation. But at the same time, he didn't want to let the two dangerous men get away so that they could potentially hurt other innocent people. Taking a deep breath, Ben opened the car door and called his canine to his side before the two of them ventured into the woods. Ben ran through the dense trees following Lord, who had noticed the scent of the two men. A few moments later, Ben heard one of the men muttering to himself just a few feet ahead of him. The officer got out his gun and began to silently creep closer to the unsuspecting man. Ben told the canine to stay where he was, as he didn't want to risk the dog getting hurt, but as the policeman made his way into the small clearing where the criminal was, he realized there was only one man standing there. Just as Ben was about to look around for the second man, he felt an incredibly sharp pain in his side. A man sneaked up on the police officer and injured him with a knife. Lord, sensing his handler's distress, bravely intervened. He attacked the two men, biting the one who hurt his owner and holding on tightly. The second man managed to separate Lord from his partner using a large branch, but the dog was injured in the process. The criminals escaped as the police sirens approached. Lord stayed by his fallen owner, barking to guide the backup officers. Both injured officers were found and taken to the hospital, but sadly, Ben didn't survive. Lord, devastated by the loss, became depressed and avoided interactions. He was given to Ben's family to live with them. The day of the police officer's burial arrived. Everyone from the police station, along with Ben's family and Lord, attended the funeral, and as the man's coffin was lowered into the ground, Lord began to bark, and as if asking for his owner to get up and give him a cuddle like he used to. Sadly, it was not meant to be. As the funeral came to an end, Ben's family began to make their way towards the car to go home. When his wife Sarah noticed that Lord was missing, not wanting to lose another beloved family member, Sarah went in search of the canine. Eventually, she found him lying down next to Ben's grave. Sarah tried to coax Lord away from the grave, but nothing the woman did or said got the dog to move. Eventually, she tried to grab the canine's collar to get him to go with her. However, the priest and man's wife felt something wrong with the dog. Once she reached for him, Lord began to growl. It was clear that no one was going to get him to move from his master's grave that night. Not knowing what else to do, Sarah left the dog at Ben's graveside, believing that she would be able to pick him up the next day. However, the next morning, Lord was just as determined to stay at the grave as he'd been the night before. Over the next few days, the loyal dog did not move from his spot. Sarah would return twice a day to make sure that the dog had something to eat and drink before leaving the heartbroken pup to guard his lost owner. One day, as Lord was guarding this deceased owner, one of Ben's friends from the policeman called Joe approached the grave to drop off some flowers and some food for the dog. But as Sam stood at Ben's grave, Lord suddenly began to growl. For the first time in days, the dog stood up and moved away from the grave towards the two voices, which the canine could hear coming from the street. Curious Joe followed the agitated pup until he was able to see what had upset the dog. Walking along the road were the two men who had injured Lord and Ben. Upon noticing the criminals, Lord immediately leaped into action and bit into the leg of one of the unsuspecting men. The man screamed in terror and fell to the pavement, where the angry canine was able to keep him pinned down with the threat of biting his neck. The second criminal tried to make a run for it, but was quickly stopped by Joe, who was able to subdue and handcuff him before the two criminals were arrested and taken back to the police station. Lord, however, walked back to Ben's grave. The dog gave one last little whine before walking away back to Sam. It seemed the pup had fulfilled a promise to capture the men who had taken Ben's life. With the criminals safely behind bars, Lord lived the rest of his life with Sarah, content to visit Ben's grave on occasion instead of staying there all day and night. Thanks to this amazing dog, two dangerous criminals were put behind bars and the police officer was able to rest in peace. Dogs are the most loyal animals. Here's another way to show the deep love for the late owner. There is a scientific basis for this. Domestic dogs are descended from wolves, which man once took in and tamed with shelter and food in return for them acting as guard dogs. A loyal dog named Captain has died after sleeping at his master's graveside night for 11 years. The black Alsat Ben was some 4 years old when Miguel Guzman, who had brought the dog as a present for his son, Dan Ben, passed away in 2006 in Vela. Carlos Paz near Cordoba, Argentina's second city. The dog disappeared not long afterwards, and the family thought that he found a new home or had been killed, but several months later, on one of their visits to the cemetery during 2007, there was Captain. Through their astonishment, neighbors told them how they started to feed him when they realized he slept by the grave each night, and so the grieving hound continued his sad vigil until dying himself a few days ago, at about 15 years of age, the daily newspaper Lavo reported. The family was amazed because the cemetery was far from their home, and their dog Capitan had never been there before he went missing. 6 years ago, after Mr. Guzman's death, his widow Veronica shared that they searched for Capitan but couldn't find him. They thought he might have been hit by a car and died. However, the following Sunday when they went to the cemetery, Capitan recognized them. He came barking and wailing as if he were crying. Veronica said they had never taken him to the cemetery, so it was a mystery how he found the place. They returned the next Sunday, and Capitan was there again. This time he followed them home for a while, but then went back to the cemetery before it got dark. Veronica believed that Capitan didn't want to leave Miguel alone at night. The cemetery's director, Hector Basiga, explained that Capitan arrived at the cemetery on his own and eventually found his master's tomb. During the day, Capitan would wander around the cemetery, but always return to the grave. Every evening at 6 o'clock, he would lie down on top of the grave and stay there all night. The cemetery staff took care of Capitan, providing food and support. Mr. Guzman's son shared that he had tried to bring Capitan home, but the loyal dog always went back to the cemetery. He believed that Capitan would stay there until he passed away, looking after his dad. This story is reminiscent of Hachiko and Akita, who waited at a Tokyo train station for their master's return for 9 years after his death in 1925.